This is a story about love, after everything. Tell me where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Everyone in the room knew money could solve almost anything except this. The crystal chandeliers shimmered above a sea of tailored suits and champagne flutes, the soft hum of polite laughter filling the private dining hall on the 42nd floor, where the city lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls like a promise of control and power. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Caldwell, a man who had built a 9-figure empire before turning 40. A man who negotiated billion-dollar deals with the calm precision of a chess master. A man who did not lose, not in business, not in strategy, not in life. Yet tonight was not about acquisitions or leverage or control. Tonight was about his twins, Oliver and Owen, turning 7, their small hands gripping each other as they stood beside the towering cake. Identical smiles under the soft golden light, the kind of moment Ethan rarely allowed himself to slow down and notice. And yet something shifted, subtle at first, almost invisible. The way Oliver's laughter faltered, the way Owen's grip tightened, the way their color, so full of life just seconds ago, began to fade into something pale, then colder, then something no parent ever wants to see. And the room didn't understand it yet, not fully, not until one of the boys swayed slightly, his small fingers loosening around the fork he had been holding, the silver utensil clinking softly against the plate, a sound too quiet for the chaos it would become. Because then someone noticed, a guest leaned in, confusion knitting their brow. Another voice rose, uncertain. Are they okay? And in a matter of seconds the polished elegance of the evening cracked, voices overlapping, chairs scraping against the marble floor, someone reaching for a phone, someone else calling for help. The word doctor floating through the air like a fragile lifeline no one could grasp, and Ethan, who had faced hostile takeovers, market crashes, negotiations that could destroy companies, found himself standing still, completely still, as if his body had forgotten how to move. Because this was different. This was not a problem with a solution waiting on the other side of a contract. This was his son's, and they were slipping into something he could not control, and then, almost unnoticed in the chaos, a tray hit the floor, the sharp clatter of glass against polished stone cutting through the noise just long enough to draw a few startled glances. A waitress standing near the edge of the room, her uniform simple, her posture steady, her eyes not wide with panic like everyone else, but focused, locked onto the two boys with a kind of stillness that didn't belong in a room unraveling this quickly. Clara Whitmore had been moving through the evening like background noise, refilling water, clearing plates, invisible in the way service staff are trained to be. But now she wasn't invisible anymore, not to herself, not to the moment unfolding in front of her, because she saw what others didn't, not just two children in distress, but the pattern, the timing, the subtle signs that spoke louder than the noise around them, the way their breathing changed, the way their posture shifted, the way the room itself seemed to press in on them, and while others hesitated, waiting for someone more qualified, someone more important, someone with a title or a degree or authority, Clara didn't wait. She stepped forward, not fast, not dramatically, just enough to close the distance, her shoes silent against the marble, her voice even when it came, not raised, not frantic, but clear enough to cut through the confusion. "You're making it worse," she said, not to anyone in particular, and yet directly to everyone. And the words landed differently than the shouting, not louder, but sharper, because they carried certainty, and for a split second, the room paused, not because they understood, but because they felt it, that quiet confidence that didn't ask for permission. And Ethan turned, his eyes meeting hers for the first time, expecting fear, expecting hesitation, expecting someone who didn't belong in this moment. But what he saw instead made something inside him shift, just slightly, just enough to notice. Because she wasn't afraid, she wasn't impressed, she wasn't even looking at him the way most people did, measuring his worth by the cut of his suit or the weight of his name. She was looking past him, at the only thing that mattered, and for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell realized that the most important person in the room wasn't the one everyone had been watching just moments ago. Clara did not rush, because rushing was how people made mistakes, and mistakes were what turned moments like this into something irreversible. So instead she moved with a deliberate calm that felt almost out of place against the rising panic, her hand gently but firmly guiding one of the guests back as they leaned too close, her voice steady when she spoke again. Please give them space. And it was not a request, not really, because something in her tone made people listen, even those who had been shouting just seconds before, even those who had been convinced they needed to do something, anything, to help, now stepping back without fully understanding why, creating a small pocket of stillness around the two boys, and Clara lowered herself to their level, her knees brushing against the polished floor, her eyes scanning quickly, not missing the smallest detail, the way Oliver's shoulders were rising too high with each shallow breath, the way Owen's fingers curled inward as if holding onto something invisible, and she placed two fingers lightly near Oliver's neck, not pressing, just feeling, counting, measuring, her expression unchanged even as the noise of the room faded behind her, because for her, there was no room, no crowd, no billionaire standing just feet away. There was only the pattern, the rhythm, the fragile line between panic and precision, and Ethan watched, his chest tight, his thoughts racing in every direction except the one that mattered, because he did not understand what she was doing. He did not know why she was the one in control, and yet no one else was stepping forward. No one else was stopping her, not even him. And that realization unsettled him more than the chaos itself, because he was used to being the one who decided, the one who directed, the one who fixed things, and now he was standing there, hands empty, watching a woman he had not noticed 10 minutes ago take control of the most important moment of his life. And Clara glanced up at him briefly, not long enough to challenge, not soft enough to reassure, just a quick, assessing look that carried a message he could not ignore. I need you to trust me, she said, and the words landed differently than anything else that had been said that night. Not louder, not dramatic, but grounded, certain, and Ethan hesitated, just for a second, because trust was not something he gave easily, not in business, not in life, and certainly not to a stranger in a waitress uniform. But then Oliver made a small, strained sound, barely audible, and that was enough, because in that moment, pride had no place, control had no value, and Ethan nodded, once, a silent agreement that shifted something invisible between them, and Clara returned her focus immediately, her hands moving with purpose now, one adjusting Oliver's position, tilting him slightly, the other guiding Owen's shoulders back just enough to open space, her movement small, almost simple to an untrained eye, but precise in a way that suggested they had been practiced, repeated, understood at a level deeper than instinct. And the room held its breath, literally, conversations cut off mid-sentence, glasses left untouched, phones lowered as if even the smallest distraction might break whatever fragile process was unfolding. And then, for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, nothing happened, the kind of nothing that felt heavy, suffocating, like the pause before a storm decides whether it will pass or break. And Clara did not rush to fill it. She did not speak. She did not look around for reassurance. She simply stayed there, steady, present, her eyes fixed on the boys, waiting, counting, trusting the timing she had set into motion. And then Oliver's chest hitched, a sharp, unexpected movement that made several guests gasp, and Clara's hand shifted slightly, adjusting again, guiding, not forcing, and Owen followed, a faint, uneven breath breaking through the silence. And it was not dramatic, not a sudden return to normal, just a small, fragile change, but it was enough for the room to exhale all at once, enough for hope to slip back in where fear had taken hold, and Ethan felt it before he saw it, that subtle shift, that almost imperceptible easing of tension, and he dropped to his knees beside them, his suit forgotten, his focus narrowing. Completely. Oliver, he said, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. Owen. And the boys did not answer, not yet, but their breathing had changed, just enough to matter, and Clara finally leaned back slightly, not fully stepping away, not claiming victory, just creating space, her expression still calm, still unreadable, as if this outcome had always been the one she expected. And one of the guests whispered, almost in disbelief, "How did she?" But no one finished the question, because the answer was standing right there, in the quiet confidence of a woman who had just done what no one else in the room knew how to do. And Ethan looked at her again. Really looked this time. Not as a background figure, not as part of the service, but as the person who had just stepped into a moment he could not control and changed its direction completely. And for the first time in years, he did not ask how much it would cost. He did not calculate the value. He did not think about leverage or return. He simply asked, his voice low, almost uncertain, "Who are you?" And Clara met his gaze, just as steady as before, a faint hint of something unreadable in her eyes. Not pride, not fear, something quieter, something deeper, and she gave the same answer she always gave, the one that never quite told the whole truth. "Just someone who pays attention," she said, as if that explained everything, and in a way it did. The room did not return to normal right away, because moments like that did not simply reset. They lingered, stretching across the silence that followed, reshaping the way people looked at one another, and especially the way they looked at Clara, who was already standing again, already stepping back into the edges of the room as if she had never intended to stay at the center. Her hands steady as she reached down to pick up a fallen napkin, her movements quiet, almost routine, as though what had just happened belonged to someone else entirely. And yet every eye followed her now, not with curiosity, but with something closer to disbelief, because it was easier to understand panic than it was to understand calm, easier to accept chaos than precision. And Ethan remained on his knees a moment longer, his attention locked on his sons, watching the rise and fall of their chests with a focus that excluded everything else. Each breath a confirmation, each second a fragile victory. And when Oliver finally blinked, slow and confused, Ethan exhaled a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his hand brushing gently against the boy's hair, a gesture so instinctive it bypassed the version of himself the world knew, the version that calculated, negotiated, controlled. And for a brief moment he was not a billionaire, not a figure of authority, just a father who had almost lost something he could not replace. And then the sound of hurried footsteps broke through the quiet. Medical staff arriving at last, their presence efficient, professional, asking questions, checking vitals, confirming what Clara had already set in motion. And one of them glanced at her briefly, a flicker of recognition passing between professionals who did not need introductions to understand competence. But Clara only gave a small nod, nothing more, before stepping further back, dissolving once again into the background she seemed to prefer. And Ethan noticed that the way she did not linger, did not seek acknowledgement, did not wait for gratitude, and it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain, because in his world, value was always measured, recognized, rewarded. And here stood someone who had just altered the outcome of his entire night, perhaps more than that, and she was already returning to work as if it meant nothing, as if it was simply what needed to be done. And he stood slowly, his movements less controlled than usual, his gaze tracking her as she moved toward the service station, reaching for another tray, adjusting a glass. The same task she had been performing before everything changed, and for a second, it almost felt absurd. The contrast between what she had just done and what she was doing now. And Ethan crossed the room, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a quiet determination that mirrored her own earlier steps. And when he reached her, she did not turn immediately, as if she already knew he was there, as if she had anticipated this moment without needing to look. And he paused, searching for words that did not come easily to him, because he was used to speaking in terms of outcomes, strategies, numbers, and none of those applied here. None of them felt sufficient. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of its usual edge. "They said they are stabilizing," he began, as if offering information she already understood. And Clara set the glass down gently before turning to face him, her expression unchanged, calm, attentive, but not expectant. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with something unspoken, something neither of them had planned for. And then Ethan added, almost reluctantly, "You knew exactly what to do." And it was not a question, not quite, more an observation he could not ignore. And Clara tilted her head slightly, considering, before giving a small, almost dismissive shrug. "I knew enough," she replied, and the simplicity of it only made it more unsettling, because it did not match the magnitude of what had just happened. And Ethan studied her more closely now. noticing details he had overlooked before, the way she carried herself, not timid, not overly confident, just grounded, the way her eyes held steady without challenge, the way there was no trace of performance in her presence, and something about that felt unfamiliar to him, because most people he encountered were either trying to impress him or avoid him, and she was doing neither. She simply existed, fully, without adjusting herself to his expectations, and he found himself asking, almost, without thinking, "Why are you working here?" And the question hung between them, heavier than he intended, because it carried assumptions he did not bother to hide, and Clara's expression shifted just slightly, not defensive, not offended, but aware, as if she had heard this question in different forms before, and she glanced past him briefly, toward the dining room where the evening was slowly attempting to resume, the soft murmur of voices returning, the illusion of normalcy rebuilding itself piece by piece, before her gaze returned to him, steady as ever. "Because this is where I am right now," she said, and it was not an answer that satisfied him, not completely, but it was an answer that did not invite further probing either, and Ethan let out a quiet breath, realizing that whatever story she carried, it was not one she offered easily, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar, not frustration, not impatience, but curiosity without control, the kind that could not be resolved with a phone call or a contract. And as Clara turned slightly, reaching for another order, already moving forward, Ethan understood something else, something he could not quite put into words yet, that whatever had just happened between them was not finished, not resolved. It was only beginning, and he found himself watching her as she walked away, not because he needed something from her, but because for the first time that night, he was not entirely sure what she might do next, and that uncertainty, quiet and unfamiliar, held his attention more than anything else in the room. By the time the last guest finished whispering about what had just happened, the illusion of control had been carefully rebuilt across the room. The music resumed, the lights remained soft, and the staff moved with even greater precision as if nothing had fractured at all. But Ethan knew better, because once you see something break, even briefly, you cannot unsee it. And as he stood near the window overlooking the city, the reflection staring back at him felt slightly unfamiliar, not because anything visible had changed, but because something internal had shifted, something quiet but undeniable, and behind him, the evening continued, conversations returning, laughter cautiously reappearing, yet his attention remained anchored elsewhere, not on the investors, not on the business partners who had come expecting a flawless evening, but on a single detail that refused to fade. The way Clara had moved without hesitation, the way she had spoken without raising her voice, the way she had acted as if the outcome was not uncertain, and that confidence unsettled him more than the crisis itself, because it did not come from status, it did not come from power, it came from something he could not immediately quantify, and Ethan Caldwell was not used to encountering things he could not measure, and so he did what he always did when faced with uncertainty. He reached for information, because information turned unknowns into leverage, into strategy, into something manageable, and as he turned away from the window, his expression returned to its familiar composure, the version of himself the world recognized, controlled, decisive, efficient, and he stepped into a quieter corner of the room, pulling his phone from his pocket, his thumb moving quickly across the screen, a message sent with the kind of clarity that required no explanation. "I need a full background on Clara Whitmore, immediately." And within seconds, the response came back, a simple confirmation that set a process in motion, one he trusted completely, because in his world, nothing remained hidden for long. And yet as he slipped the phone back into his pocket, he found himself glancing across the room again, expecting to see her where she had been moments before, but she was gone, not entirely, but shifted, repositioned, already absorbed into another section of the restaurant. Speaking quietly with a couple at a table, her posture relaxed, her expression neutral, as if she had never stepped into the center of anything, and Ethan felt something unexpected, not irritation, not impatience, but a subtle frustration at the way she seemed to exist just outside his control, and he exhaled slowly, reminding himself that this was temporary, that answers were already on their way, that whatever mystery surrounded her would soon be reduced to facts, to data, to a narrative he could understand. And yet, even as he told himself that, another part of him remained unsettled, because facts could explain what someone had done, but not always why they had done it. And as the evening finally began to wind down, the guests departing with polite words and lingering glances, the staff moving efficiently to clear what remained, Ethan found himself lingering. Longer than necessary, not out of obligation, but out of something he did not immediately name. And when he finally stepped into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft, controlled motion, the city lights reflecting in the mirrored walls, his phone vibrated again, a new message, a preliminary report already forming, efficient as always, and he opened it without hesitation, his eyes scanning the brief lines of information, age, employment history, nothing unusual at first glance, nothing that matched what he had seen, and his brow tightened slightly, because the disconnect was immediate. The woman who had just taken control of a medical emergency with quiet precision did not align with a profile that described nothing beyond standard service work, and Ethan tapped the screen once, sending a single reply, "Dig deeper," and the elevator continued its descent, smooth, controlled, predictable. Unlike the question now sitting at the center of his thoughts, and outside, the night air was cool, crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city that never fully rested. And as he stepped into the back of his car, the door closing softly behind him, he allowed himself a moment, just a moment, to sit without speaking, without directing, without deciding, and Clara's voice echoed again, not loud, not commanding, just certain. "You are making it worse," and he almost let out a quiet, humorless breath. Because in every other context, no one would have said that to him, not without consequence, not without hesitation, and yet she had, without fear, without calculation, and the driver's voice broke the silence gently. "Home, sir." And Ethan paused, his gaze shifting to the city beyond the tinted glass, the endless grid of lights, each one representing a life, a story, something unknown, and for the first time in a long time, he did not immediately choose the predictable path. "No," he said finally, his voice calm but carrying a subtle shift. "The office," and as the car pulled away from the curb, merging into the steady flow of traffic, Ethan Caldwell did not think about the next deal, the next meeting, the next move. He thought about a woman who had stepped into a moment he could not control and changed it with a single gesture, and for the first time, he was not planning how to use that information. He was trying to understand it. The office at 2 in the morning was quieter than any boardroom Ethan Caldwell had ever dominated. The city outside reduced to a distant glow through floor-to-ceiling glass, the kind of silence that did not demand attention but instead allowed thoughts to surface without interruption, and Ethan sat behind his desk, not reviewing contracts, not analyzing projections, but staring at a single file on his screen that refused to make sense, because the numbers were there, the dates, the employment history, the verified records that normally painted a clear, predictable picture of a person's life. And yet this one did not align, not with what he had seen, not with what he had experienced, and he leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled in front of him, reading the same lines again as if repetition might reveal something hidden between them. Clara Whitmore, age 28, employment listed as server. Previous positions similar, gaps unexplained but not flagged, education listed as incomplete, no advanced certifications, no active licenses, nothing that justified the kind of precision she had demonstrated, and Ethan exhaled slowly, because this was not how information worked in his world. People did not simply exceed their data. They matched it, followed it, confirmed it, and yet she had not. And that discrepancy held his attention more tightly than any opportunity he had evaluated in months. And his phone buzzed again, a follow-up message. "Digging deeper now. Preliminary inconsistency noted." And Ethan responded immediately. "I want everything." His tone concise even in text, because if there was something beneath the surface, he intended to find it. And he stood, moving toward the window, the city stretching out below him like a system he understood, predictable in its patterns, logical in its structure, unlike the variable now occupying his thoughts. And behind him, the soft click of the office door broke the quiet, his assistant stepping in with the careful awareness of someone who knew when to speak and when to wait. "Sir, the hospital called," she said gently. and Ethan turned slightly, his focus shifting instantly. "And?" he asked, his voice controlled but carrying a trace of something less guarded, and she offered a small, reassuring nod. "The boys are stable. They are being monitored overnight. The doctors said the intervention came at exactly the right time." And Ethan held that information for a moment, letting it settle, because the words were clinical, expected, but the meaning behind them was not, and he nodded once. "Thank you." And as she stepped back out, closing the door softly behind her, Ethan returned his gaze to the city, but the view had changed, not physically, but in the way he processed it, because control, the thing he had built everything on, had proven limited in the one moment that mattered most. And someone else had stepped into that gap without hesitation, without permission, and that realization lingered, reshaping the way he understood value, not in numbers, not in assets, but in presence, in awareness, in the ability to act when it mattered most. And his phone buzzed again, sharper this time, the update arriving faster than expected, and he returned to his desk, opening the file, his eyes scanning quickly, and there it was, the first real inconsistency. Education records amended. Previously unlisted enrollment, Columbia University, medical track, top-tier performance. Incomplete residency. Withdrawal without formal explanation, and Ethan's expression shifted, not dramatically, just enough to indicate recognition, because now the pieces began to align, not completely, but enough to form a direction, and he scrolled further, the details expanding, clinical rotations, high evaluations, remarks from supervisors that did not match someone who simply walked away without reason. And he leaned forward slightly, his focus sharpening, because this was the part that mattered, not the visible surface, but the hidden narrative beneath it. And then he saw it. A brief note, almost buried within the report. Incident during final year, pediatric case, outcome unsuccessful, no disciplinary action, voluntary withdrawal immediately after. And Ethan stopped, his hand resting lightly against the desk, because the words were minimal, almost intentionally so, but the implication was not, and he did not need more detail to understand the weight behind it. Not fully, but enough to see the outline of a decision made under pressure, a moment that changed direction, and he leaned back again, the silence of the office returning, but now it felt different, less empty, more reflective, because Clara Whitmore was no longer an unknown variable, not entirely. She was a pattern interrupted, a trajectory altered, and yet despite that, she had stepped into his world, into his moment, and acted without hesitation, without visible doubt. And that contradiction held his attention more firmly than any data point, because it suggested something beyond training, beyond experience, something quieter, something rooted deeper, and Ethan allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible shift in perspective, because for the first time, he was not thinking about how to categorize her, how to define her role. He was thinking about why she had not stayed where she clearly belonged, and more importantly, why she had not lost that ability to act when it mattered. And he closed the file slowly, not because he was finished, but because he understood enough for now, enough to know that this was not a situation that would be resolved through a report. And as he reached for his phone again, his decision came not from strategy, not from calculation, but from something simpler, something more direct. "Find out when she works tomorrow," he sent, and the message disappeared into the system he controlled. But the intention behind it felt different, less about uncovering, more about understanding. And as Ethan Caldwell sat alone in the quiet of his office, the city still glowing beyond the glass, he realized that for the first time in a long time, he was not chasing an outcome, he was following a person. Morning arrived without ceremony, the kind that slipped quietly into the city rather than announcing itself, and by 8:15 the restaurant had returned to its usual rhythm, polished, efficient, predictable, the aftermath of the previous night reduced to whispers among staff and a few lingering glances from those who had heard just enough to be curious but not enough to understand. And Clara Whitmore moved through it all with the same measured pace as always, her uniform pressed, her posture steady, her attention focused not on what had happened but on what needed to be done next, because that was how she operated, one task, one moment at a time, no lingering, no revisiting, just forward. And yet there was a subtle difference, not in her movements, not in her tone, but in the way people watched her now, The way conversations paused slightly when she passed. The way even the manager, who usually measured everything in efficiency and turnover, seemed to offer her a longer look than necessary, as if trying to reconcile the version of her they thought they knew with the one they had glimpsed the night before. And Clara noticed it. Of course she did, but she did not acknowledge it, because attention was not something she sought, and more importantly, it was not something she trusted. And as she reached for a coffee pot, refilling a cup with practiced precision, the bell above the door chimed softly, a sound that normally blended into the background. But today it carried a weight she did not expect, because when she glanced up, just briefly, she saw him. And for a fraction of a second, something shifted, not panic, not surprise, but recognition layered with something quieter, something more cautious. And Ethan Caldwell stepped into the space as if he belonged there, not because of his suit, not because of the subtle presence that followed him, but because he carried himself with the same controlled awareness he had displayed the night before. And yet there was something different now, something less guarded, less performative, as if he had left part of that armor behind. And Clara returned her focus to the table in front of her, finishing the pour, placing the pot down with care, because whatever he was doing here, it did not change. Her role did not change the boundaries she had built carefully over time. And Ethan paused just inside the entrance, his eyes scanning the room not with the casual glance of a customer, but with intention, searching, locating. And when his gaze found her, it did not linger in surprise. It settled, as if confirming something he had already decided. And he moved toward her, not quickly, not dramatically, just directly. And Clara felt it before he reached her, that subtle shift in the space around her, the awareness of someone approaching with purpose. And she turned just as he stopped beside her, their proximity closer than it had been the night before, but the dynamic different, less chaotic, more deliberate. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the context had changed, the urgency replaced by something quieter, something harder to define. And Ethan broke the silence first, his voice even, controlled, but without the edge it had carried before. "How are they?" Clara asked, and the question came before she could stop it. Simple, direct, revealing more concern than she intended. And Ethan noticed that, the way it came naturally, without calculation, and he answered just as simply, "They are fine." And there was a brief pause, a small space where something unspoken passed between them, relief meeting acknowledgement, and Clara nodded once, a small movement that seemed to close that part of the conversation. And she reached for her notepad, the familiar motion grounding her. "Would you like a table?" she asked, her tone professional, neutral, as if resetting the dynamic to something safer, something defined. And Ethan allowed the faintest hint of a smile, not wide, not obvious, just enough to suggest awareness. "I am not here for breakfast," he replied. And Clara met his gaze again, steady, unflinching. "Then you are in the wrong place," she said. And there it was, a subtle edge, not confrontational, but clear, a boundary drawn without raising her voice. And for a moment, Ethan almost laughed, not out loud, but internally, because it had been a long time since someone had spoken to him that way, without hesitation, without fear of consequence. And instead of pushing against it, he stepped slightly to the side, adjusting his approach. "I came to say, thank you," he said. And the words were simple, but the delivery carried weight, because he was not a man who offered gratitude easily, not in this form, not without expectation attached. And Clara studied him for a moment, not the words, but the intention behind them. And finding nothing performative, nothing transactional, she gave a small nod. "You are welcome," she replied. And just like that, the exchange could have ended, clean, contained. But Ethan did not move, did not leave, because he had not come for closure. He had come for something else, something he was still trying to define. And Clara sensed that too. The way he remained, the way the conversation had not fully settled. And she tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but direct. "Is that all?" she asked. And Ethan hesitated, just briefly, because the answer was no, not entirely. But for the first time in a long time, he chose not to push, not to force the next step. And he gave a small, measured nod. "For now," he said. And Clara held his gaze for a second longer, as if weighing that answer, before turning back to her work, the moment folding back into the rhythm of the room. and Ethan stood there for a fraction longer than necessary before stepping back, because he understood something now that he had not the night before, that whatever this was, whatever had begun in that moment of crisis, it was not something he could control, not something he could accelerate. It would move at its own pace, on her terms as much as his. And as he walked toward the door, the soft chimes sounding again as he left, Ethan Caldwell realized that for the first time, he was not trying to close a deal, he was learning how to wait. The rest of the day unfolded with a rhythm that should have felt ordinary. But for Ethan Caldwell, nothing about it carried the same weight as before, not the meetings that followed, not the decisions that would have once demanded his full attention, not even the steady flow of numbers crossing his desk, because beneath all of it, something quieter persisted, something he could not reduce to data or strategy. And as the hours passed, he found his focus drifting in ways that would have been unacceptable just days ago, moments where his mind returned not to projections or negotiations, but to a single image, Clara standing in the middle of chaos without raising her voice, without seeking authority, and somehow becoming the only person anyone listened to. And it unsettled him, not because it threatened him, but because it revealed something he had overlooked for years, that control did not always come from power. Sometimes it came from presence, from clarity, from the ability to act when others hesitated. And by late afternoon, that realization had shifted from curiosity into something more intentional, because Ethan was not a man who let questions remain unanswered for long. But this time, the answer was not in another report, not in another file. It was in proximity, in observation, in understanding the person behind the action. And so when his final meeting ended earlier than expected, he did not return to his office, did not extend the day into another series of calculated moves. Instead, he did something that felt almost unfamiliar. He redirected his driver without explanation, the car moving through the city with the same quiet efficiency as always, but the destination different, not strategic, not necessary, simply chosen. And when he stepped out once again in front of the restaurant, the early evening light casting long reflections across the glass, he paused for a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. Because this was not a place he usually returned to twice in the same day, not without purpose. And yet here he was, not with a reservation, not with a meeting, just with a question he had not fully formed. And inside, the atmosphere had shifted from morning calm to evening anticipation, the subtle hum of preparation building toward another night of service, and Clara moved through it all as she always did, precise, focused, unaffected by the patterns around her. And when she noticed him this time, there was no flicker of surprise, no pause in her movement, just a brief acknowledgement in her eyes before she continued with what she was doing, as if his presence was neither unexpected nor particularly significant. And Ethan found that strangely grounding, because it removed the performance from the moment, the expectation, the need to present himself as anything other than what he was. And he approached her again, not with the urgency of the previous night, not even with the quiet formality of the morning, but with something simpler, something more direct. "Do you ever leave this place?" he asked, and the question was not as dismissive as it might have sounded. It carried curiosity, a genuine attempt to understand the boundaries she had set for herself. And Clara glanced at him briefly, her hands still moving as she adjusted a table setting, her voice calm. "Sometimes," she replied, and there was a faint hint of something almost resembling humor in the way she said it, subtle, understated, but present. And Ethan allowed a small breath to escape, not quite a laugh, but close enough, because it had been a long time since a conversation with someone outside his world had felt this unstructured, this uncalculated. And he leaned slightly against the back of a chair, not imposing, not demanding, just present. "I would like to understand why you left." "Medicine," he said, and the words were direct, not softened, not disguised, because that was how he operated. And Clara's hands paused for just a fraction of a second, the smallest interruption in her rhythm, but enough to signal that he had crossed into something more personal, something she did not offer lightly. And when she resumed her movement, her voice carried the same calm as before, but with a subtle shift, a boundary reinforced rather than removed. "That is not something you need to understand," she said, and there was no defensiveness in it, no irritation, just clarity. And Ethan nodded slowly, because he recognized that tone, not as rejection, but as control, the kind he respected, the kind he understood, and instead of pushing further, he adjusted, shifting the conversation without forcing it. Then help me understand something else, he said, and Clara glanced at him again, measuring, waiting, and he continued, why you stepped in last night. And this time the question was different, not about her past, but about her choice, and Clara considered it for a moment, not because she did not have an answer, but because she was deciding how much of it to give. And finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. Because no one else did, she said, and the simplicity of it landed heavier than any explanation, because it removed complexity, removed justification, leaving only truth. And Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, recognizing something in that answer that aligned with a part of himself he had not acknowledged in a long time. The part that acted not for advantage, but because action was required. And for a brief moment, the distance between them felt smaller, not in space, but in understanding, and Clara returned to her work once more, the conversation settling into silence, but not an empty one, not unresolved, just incomplete. In a way that did not demand immediate closure, and Ethan straightened slightly, his decision forming without the usual analysis, without the layered considerations he applied to everything else. Will you have dinner with me? He asked, and the question was simple, direct, without the weight of expectation he might have carried before, and Clara looked at him, really looked this time, not as a customer, not as a stranger, but as a man asking something without trying to control the answer. And, for the first time, she did not respond immediately, because this was different. This was not about service, not about roles, it was about choice, and that was something she did not take lightly. Clara did not answer right away, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was deliberate, the kind of pause that meant something was being considered rather than avoided, and Ethan did not interrupt it, did not fill it with persuasion or explanation, because for once he understood that pushing would only break the moment, not move it forward. And around them the restaurant continued to shift into its evening rhythm, the soft clink of glassware, the low murmur of early guests being seated, the quiet urgency of staff preparing for the rush, and yet in the small space between them, everything felt still, as if time had narrowed to a single decision that neither of them was rushing to make. And Clara finally exhaled slowly, her gaze steady but thoughtful. You do not ask questions like that casually, she said. And her tone was not accusing, not defensive, just observant, and Ethan gave a slight nod, acknowledging the truth in it, because nothing he did was casual, not by habit, not by design. But this felt different, not strategic, not calculated, and he allowed that to show, just enough. I am not asking casually, he replied, and there was no edge in his voice, no expectation attached, just a statement. And Clara studied him for a moment longer, not his words, but the space behind them, the intention that most people hid but he, for once, did not. And she shifted her weight slightly, her hand resting against the back of a chair as if grounding herself in something familiar, because this was unfamiliar territory, not the question itself, but the way it had been asked, without leverage, without assumption, without the subtle pressure she had learned to recognize and avoid, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to categorize, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. You are used to getting yes, she said, and Ethan almost smiled again, not because it was wrong, but because it was accurate in a way few people ever said out loud, and he answered just as directly, not always, and Clara's brow lifted slightly, a quiet skepticism that did not need to be spoken, and for a brief second, there was something almost light in the air between them. A subtle shift away from the weight of the previous night, something closer to balance. And then she looked away, just briefly, her gaze moving across the room, taking in the tables, the guests, the rhythm she understood so well. And when she looked back at him, her expression had settled again, calm, composed, certain. I do not go to dinner with customers, she said. And the boundary was clear, not harsh, not rigid, just defined. And Ethan nodded, accepting it without resistance, because he had expected as much, and yet he did not step back, did not leave, because the conversation was not finished, not yet, and he adjusted again, not pushing against the boundary, but shifting its frame. Then do not go as a waitress, he said. And the words were simple, but they carried a different kind of invitation, one that did not rely on roles or expectations, and Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, not in irritation, but in thought, because that distinction mattered more than he might realize, and she let the silence stretch again, weighing not just the offer, but the implications of accepting it, because stepping outside of the role she had carefully built meant stepping into something less controlled, less predictable, and she had spent years avoiding exactly that. And yet there was something in the way he stood there, not demanding, not persuading, just present, that made the decision less about risk and more about choice. And she exhaled softly, almost to herself, before meeting his gaze once more. 1 hour, she said, and Ethan's expression did not change dramatically. But there was a subtle shift, a quiet acknowledgement of the terms, because this was not an agreement he controlled. It was one he was being allowed to enter, and he inclined his head slightly. 1 hour, he repeated, and Clara added, her voice steady. After my shift, and Ethan nodded again. I will be here, he said, and this time, there was something almost unfamiliar in the way he said it, not certainty of outcome, but certainty of intention, and Clara held his gaze for a second longer, as if confirming that he understood the weight of what had just been agreed to, before turning back to her work, the conversation closing not with finality, but with quiet anticipation, and Ethan stepped back, not lingering, not attempting to extend the moment beyond what it was, because he understood now that this was not something to be rushed, not something to be managed. It would unfold at its own pace. And as he moved toward the door, the evening crowd beginning to fill the space behind him, he allowed himself a small, almost unnoticeable shift in perspective, because for the first time in a long time, he was not preparing for a negotiation, he was preparing for a conversation, and that difference, subtle as it was, changed everything. The hour did not begin when they sat down. It began the moment Clara walked out of the staff door and into the cool night air, the city quieter now, but still alive in the way only Manhattan could be, a constant low hum beneath everything. And she paused for just a second, adjusting the sleeves of her coat, grounding herself in a small, familiar motion before stepping forward, because this was not part of her routine, not something she had done in a long time. And across the street, Ethan stood, waiting, not in the commanding way he occupied boardrooms, but simply present, hands in his coat pockets, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he had made a decision and was not questioning it. And when he saw her, he did not wave, did not call out. He just met her halfway, closing the distance without urgency. And for a brief moment, they stood facing each other outside the glow of the restaurant. No uniforms, no roles, just two people who had stepped out of their respective worlds into something undefined. And Ethan spoke first, his voice quieter now, shaped by the hour. Thank you for coming. And Clara gave a small nod. You said 1 hour, she replied, not unkind, just precise. And Ethan allowed the faintest trace of a smile, because he understood that this was her way of maintaining control, of setting terms in a situation that could easily blur them. And he gestured down the street. There is a place 2 blocks away, nothing extravagant, he said. And Clara raised an eyebrow slightly. You felt the need to clarify that, she observed, and Ethan exhaled softly, almost amused. I am learning, he said, and that earned him the smallest shift in her expression, not quite a smile, but close enough to register, and they walked side by side, not close, not distant, just aligned, their pace unhurried, the city lights reflecting off the pavement, the occasional passing car filling the space between their silence, and neither of them rushed to fill it, because this silence was different from the one in the restaurant. It was not about tension or uncertainty, it was about adjustment, about stepping into a rhythm neither of them was used to. And when they reached the small restaurant Ethan had mentioned, it was exactly as described, understated, warm lighting, quiet conversation, the kind of place where no one looked twice at them. And that, more than anything, seemed intentional. And as they sat down across from each other, the space between them defined by a simple wooden table, Clara glanced around briefly, taking in the details, before her attention returned to him. You chose this carefully, she said, and Ethan did not deny it. I chose it differently, he corrected, and Clara tilted her head slightly, considering that distinction, because it suggested effort without performance, intention without display, and the server approached, taking their order with minimal interruption, and when they were alone again, the quiet returned. But this time it felt less like a pause and more like an opening, and Ethan leaned back slightly, not dominating the space, just present within it. "You asked how they were," he said, and Clara nodded once. "I did," and he continued. "They asked about you." And that caught her attention, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough. "What did you tell them?" she asked, and Ethan's gaze held steady. "That someone helped when it mattered." And Clara looked down briefly, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table, a small, almost absent motion, and when she looked back up, her voice was softer. "That is enough," she said, and Ethan watched her for a moment, recognizing the way she deflected recognition, not out of modesty, but out of choice, and he did not challenge it, because he understood now that respect, real respect, was not about insisting on acknowledgement. It was about accepting how someone chose to be seen, and he shifted slightly, the conversation moving forward. "You were at Columbia," he said, not as an accusation, not as a reveal, just as a statement, and Clara's expression stilled, not surprised, because she had expected this, expected him to look, to find, to connect the pieces, and she met his gaze directly. "You looked," she said, and Ethan inclined his head slightly. "I did." And there was no apology in it. But there was no intrusion either, just honesty, and Clara held that for a moment, weighing it, before giving a small nod. "Of course you did," she replied, and there was no bitterness in her tone, just acknowledgement of who he was, and Ethan leaned forward slightly, not pressing, but engaging. "You left," he said, and this time, it was not a question, and Clara exhaled slowly, her gaze shifting briefly to the side, as if aligning her thoughts before speaking. "Yes," she said simply, and the conversation hovered there, at the edge of something deeper, something that would not be explained in one sentence or 1 hour, and Ethan did not rush it, did not push past the boundary she had already set, because he understood now that understanding her was not about extracting answers. It was about allowing them to surface, if and when she chose, and so instead, he asked something else, something quieter. "Do you miss it?" And Clara paused, not because the question was difficult, but because the answer was not simple, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that had not been there before. "Every day," she said, and the honesty of it settled between them, unadorned, unprotected, and for the first time since they had sat down. Ethan did not respond immediately, because some answers did not require a reply, they required presence, and he stayed there, in that moment, not as a billionaire, not as a man who solved problems, but as someone listening. And Clara looked at him then, really looked, and saw something she had not expected, not power, not control, but restraint, and that, more than anything else, changed the way the next minutes would unfold. The silence after her answer did not feel empty. It felt full, like something had been placed carefully between them and neither of them was in a hurry to move it. And Ethan remained still, not because he did not have something to say, but because for the first time in a long time, he understood that speaking too quickly would diminish what had just been offered. And Clara watched him, not directly at first, but through the subtle awareness of someone who had learned to read people without needing them to explain themselves. And what she saw was not what she expected, not the immediate pivot, not the strategic follow-up, but restraint, a kind of quiet respect that did not try to turn her words into an opportunity. And that shifted something, small but noticeable, because it made the space feel safer, less like an exchange and more like a moment. And the food arrived, simple, understated, placed between them without interruption, and for a few seconds, the focus shifted naturally. Forks lifted, glasses adjusted, the normal rhythm of a meal creating a pause that neither of them needed to force, and Clara took a small breath, grounding herself again, because what she had said was more than she usually allowed, more than she intended when she agreed to 1 hour, and yet she did not regret it, not entirely, because there was something different about the way he listened, something that did not feel like it would be used against her later, and Ethan set his glass down. Carefully, his movements unhurried, his attention still fully on her even when he was not looking directly. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a subtle shift, softer, more considered. "What made you stay away?" he asked, and this time, The question was not about facts, not about timelines. It was about choice, and Clara felt it immediately, the difference in the way it landed, because it did not demand explanation. It invited it, and she hesitated, not because she did not have an answer, but because this was the part she did not share, the part that did not fit neatly into a sentence or a story, and she looked down briefly, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. A small, controlled movement that gave her a moment to decide, and when she looked back up, her voice was steady, but quieter. "Because I was not sure I could trust myself to make the right call again," she said, and the words settled heavily, not dramatic, not detailed, but enough to reveal the weight behind them, and Ethan felt that, not as information, but as something closer to understanding, because he recognized the shape of that doubt. Even if the context was different, the idea that one moment could alter the way you saw your own decisions, your own judgment, and he did not interrupt, did not soften it with reassurance, because he understood that what she was saying did not need to be fixed, it needed to be heard. And Clara continued, not because she felt pressured, but because something about the way he remained present made it easier to keep going. "When you are trained to act, hesitation is not supposed to exist," she said, her eyes steady now. "And when it does, even once, it changes everything." And there was no self-pity in her voice, no attempt to justify, just a clear, honest statement of what had happened inside her. And Ethan leaned forward slightly, not to close the distance, but to meet her where she was. "And last night," he said, his tone careful, "you did not hesitate." And Clara held his gaze, the memory passing through her expression briefly, not visible to anyone else, but present. "No," she said, and there was a quiet certainty in that single word. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the implication was already there, hanging between them, something she had not fully acknowledged yet, and Ethan let it sit, not pushing it forward, not drawing conclusions for her, because he understood now that whatever she was rebuilding inside herself, it was not something that could be rushed. And Clara exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, as if releasing a tension she had been carrying without realizing it, and she allowed herself a small, almost hesitant observation. "It felt different," she said, more to herself than to him. And Ethan watched her, recognizing the shift, the way she was beginning to reconsider something she had long decided. And he spoke carefully, not offering advice, not framing it as a solution. "Maybe it was not different," he said. "Maybe you were." And Clara's eyes lifted to meet his, the words landing in a way she did not expect, not as correction, but as perspective. And for the first time since they had sat down, there was a pause that carried something lighter, something closer to possibility. And she let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, but enough to soften the edges of the moment. "You are very good at saying things that sound simple and are not," she said, and Ethan allowed a faint smile. "It is part of my job," he replied, and Clara shook her head slightly, a small gesture that carried a hint of warmth. "No," she said, "this is not that." And the distinction mattered, because it placed this conversation outside the roles they were used to, outside the expectations that usually defined their interactions, and the hour they had agreed on began to feel less like a limit and more like a frame, something that held the moment without constraining it. And as the city continued to move around them, unseen but ever present, Clara realized that for the first time in a long time, she was not measuring her words, not guarding every response, and Ethan, for the first time in just as long, was not trying to direct where the conversation would go. And in that quiet shift, something began to form between them, not defined, not named, but undeniable, something that did not belong to the roles they had left behind at the door, something that existed only in this shared space, this one hour that was already becoming more than either of them had expected. The hour did not end when the plates were cleared. It lingered in the space between them, stretched by something neither of them acknowledged directly, but both felt, a quiet reluctance to let the moment collapse back into something ordinary. And Clara noticed it first, not in him, but in herself, the way she had stopped checking the time, the way she had stopped measuring her words, the way the boundaries she usually maintained had softened without her realizing it. And that awareness made her shift slightly in her seat, a subtle return to control, because she did not allow moments to drift without direction, not anymore. And she glanced at the clock on the wall, a small, deliberate. Movement that marked the passing of something they had both agreed to. "It has been an hour," she said, her voice calm, not abrupt, but clear, and Ethan nodded, not surprised, because he had been aware of it too, just not focused on it. And for a second, neither of them moved, as if acknowledging that the end of the hour did not quite align with the end of the conversation, and Clara reached for her coat, her fingers moving with the same precision she applied to everything else, grounding herself in the familiar rhythm of leaving, of closing, of stepping away before something undefined could become something more complicated. And Ethan stood as well, not out of obligation, but because he understood that this was not a moment to remain seated, not a moment to extend artificially. And they walked out together, the night air cooler now, the city quieter but still alive, and for a few steps, they moved side by side without speaking, the silence no longer uncertain, but reflective. And Clara stopped just outside the restaurant, turning slightly toward him, her posture composed, her expression steady. "Thank you for dinner," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a subtle shift, because this time, it was not just politeness, it was acknowledgement, and Ethan met her gaze, holding it for a moment longer than necessary, because he understood that something had changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. "Thank you for saying yes," he replied, and there was no trace of assumption in his tone, no expectation for what came next, just recognition of what had already been given, and Clara gave a small nod, her eyes studying him briefly, as if measuring something she had not yet decided, and then she spoke again, her voice softer, but still grounded. "Do not mistake this for something it is not," she said, and the boundary was there again, not as a rejection, but as a reminder, and Ethan did not challenge it, did not reinterpret it, because he understood now that respecting her meant accepting the lines she drew, even when they limited him. "I will not," he said, and the honesty in his response held, unforced, unembellished, and Clara seemed to register that, a subtle shift in her expression that did not fully reveal itself, but did not disappear either, and she turned slightly, preparing to leave, but then paused, just for a second, her voice carrying something different when she spoke again, something quieter, less guarded. "They were lucky," she said, not looking directly at him now, and Ethan followed her gaze, understanding immediately who she meant. "No," he replied, his tone steady. "I was," and Clara glanced back at him then, her eyes holding his for a brief moment, and there was something in that look, something that acknowledged the difference between those two statements, something that recognized the weight behind his words, and she gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that did not linger long enough to be defined, before stepping back, creating distance again, and Ethan did not move to close it, did not reach for anything more, because he understood now that this was not about closing gaps, it was about allowing space, and Clara turned, beginning to walk down the street, her pace steady, her figure blending gradually into the rhythm of the city, and Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, watching not out of possession, not out of control, but out of something quieter, something that felt unfamiliar and yet entirely clear, and as she disappeared into the distance, he exhaled slowly, not with frustration, not with uncertainty, but with something closer to recognition, because he understood now that whatever this was, it was not something he could define yet, not something he could shape into a predictable outcome, and for the first time, he did not try. He simply allowed it to exist, and as he turned to leave, the city stretching out around him, he realized that for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what came next, he was thinking about what had already begun. The days that followed did not rush forward. They unfolded with a quiet consistency that neither of them had planned, yet both seemed to accept, and Clara returned to her routine with the same discipline she had always maintained. Early mornings, steady shifts, controlled interactions, but something beneath that routine had shifted, subtle but persistent, like a note held just beneath the surface of everything she did, and she noticed it in the smallest moments, the way her attention lingered a second longer than necessary when the door opened, the way she found herself listening for a voice that was not part of her usual world, and she did not question it directly, not yet, because she had learned that some changes revealed themselves only when given space, not when forced into clarity, and Ethan, in his own world, moved through his days with the same precision and expectation that had defined him for years: meetings, decisions, outcomes. But now there was a disruption in that rhythm, not visible to anyone else, not measurable in the metrics that guided his company, but present in the way he paused more often than he used to, in the way he considered things without immediately categorizing them, and most of all, in the way his attention returned, again and again, to a place that had never held significance for him before. And it did not take long before those returns became intentional, not daily, not excessive, but consistent enough to form a pattern, a quiet presence that did not demand, did not interrupt, but simply existed. And Clara noticed that too. Of course she did. The way he would appear at different times, sometimes early, sometimes late, never predictable, never announced, and always the same in one regard. He did not try to control the interaction. He did not extend beyond what was given, and that consistency mattered more than anything he could have said, because it demonstrated something she valued more than words: restraint. And one afternoon, as the light filtered softly through the windows and the restaurant moved through its slower hours, Clara approached his table without hesitation, her posture composed, her expression neutral, but her presence different, more intentional. And Ethan looked up, not surprised, because he had begun to understand her rhythms, and she spoke before he could, her voice calm but direct. "You are here often," she said, and there was no accusation in it, no edge, just observation, and Ethan nodded slightly, accepting the statement without defense. "I am," he replied, and Clara studied him for a moment, as if measuring the distance between what was said and what was meant, and then she asked, "Why?" And the question was simple, but it carried weight, because it was not about the act itself, it was about the intention behind it. And Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not have an answer, but because he wanted to give the right one, not the easiest, not the most effective, but the most honest. And when he spoke, his voice was steady. "Because I do not want this to be something that happened once," he said, and Clara held his gaze, the words settling between them. And there was a shift in her expression, not dramatic, but present, because that answer did not seek to define, did not impose expectation. It simply acknowledged value. And she exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, as if something she had been holding had eased. And she leaned back a fraction, her tone quieter now, less guarded. "You are patient," she said, and Ethan allowed a small, almost unnoticeable smile. "I am learning," he replied, echoing his own words from before. And this time, Clara did smile, just slightly, just enough to change the atmosphere between them. And for a moment, the roles that had defined their interaction seemed less rigid, less necessary. And Clara made a decision, not announced, not dramatic, just clear. "I have a day off tomorrow," she said, and Ethan's attention sharpened, not in intensity, but in presence, because he understood what that meant, not as an invitation in the way he was used to, but as an opening, something offered rather than negotiated. And he did not rush to respond, did not fill the space with plans or expectations. He simply nodded, acknowledging the moment for what it was. "I would like to spend it with you," he said, and Clara held his gaze for a second longer, as if confirming that the simplicity of the statement matched its intention. And then she nodded once, the decision settling between them without need for further explanation. And as she turned to return to her work, the rhythm of the restaurant continuing around them, something had shifted again, not in a way that could be defined or measured, but in a way that felt undeniable, because this was no longer about a single moment or a single conversation. It was about a direction, something unfolding quietly, steadily, without force. And Ethan watched her as she moved away, not because he needed to, but because for the first time in a long time, he wanted to. And in that simple realization, he understood something that no report, no data, no strategy had ever taught him, that the most valuable things in his life were not the ones he controlled, but the ones he chose to wait for. The next morning did not arrive with urgency. It arrived with light, soft and unhurried, spilling across the city in a way that made everything feel briefly suspended, as if time itself had decided to slow down. And Clara noticed at the moment she stepped outside, her usual pace easing just slightly as she adjusted to the quiet absence of routine, No shift to rush to, no tables to manage, just a day that belonged entirely to her. And that in itself felt unfamiliar, not uncomfortable, but unstructured in a way she had not allowed in a long time. And across the street, Ethan was already there, not early in the way that signaled impatience, but prepared, present, standing with the same quiet certainty that had begun to define him in her world. And when she approached, there was no formal greeting, no need for one, just a shared acknowledgement that this moment was different from the ones before, not bound by time limits or roles. And they began walking without deciding where to go, the city opening up around them not as a backdrop, but as something to move through together. And for a while, neither of them spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because they no longer felt the need to fill every space. And that silence, once unfamiliar, now felt natural, like something that belonged to both of them. And Clara glanced at him occasionally, not to measure, not to evaluate, but simply to observe. And what she saw was not the man she had first encountered, not entirely. The edges of control still there, but softened, balanced by something quieter, something more present. And Ethan noticed her glances, not directly, but in the way her attention shifted, and he did not comment on it, did not draw attention to it, because he had learned that some things were better left unspoken, allowed to exist without definition. And eventually, they found themselves in a small park, the kind that most people passed without noticing, a few benches, a stretch of green, the city. Noise reduced to a distant hum, and Clara sat down first, her posture relaxed in a way that had not been visible before, her shoulders no longer carrying the same weight. And Ethan joined her, leaving just enough space between them to respect what had not yet been said. And for a moment, they simply watched the world move, people passing, conversations blending into the background. And Clara spoke first, her voice softer than it had been in the restaurant. "I used to come to places like this after long shifts," she said, not looking at him, her gaze fixed somewhere ahead, "just to remind myself that the world kept moving." And Ethan listened, not interrupting, because he understood that this was not information, it was something she was choosing to share. And she continued, her tone steady but reflective. "I stopped after I left, and there was a pause, not heavy, not forced, just a space where the weight of that decision settled." And Ethan turned slightly toward her, his voice quiet. "Why?" he asked, and Clara exhaled slowly, her hands resting loosely in her lap. "Because it felt like I did not belong in either world anymore," she said. And the honesty in it was clear, unguarded in a way she had not allowed before. And Ethan held that for a moment, understanding not the specifics, but the feeling, the sense of being between something that was and something that could be. And he spoke carefully, not offering a solution, not trying to resolve it. "You do not have to choose only one," he said. And Clara turned to look at him then, really look, and for the first time, there was no distance in her gaze, no layer of caution separating what she felt from what she allowed him to see. And something shifted. In that moment, not sudden, not dramatic, but clear, like a line that had been quietly redrawn. And she smiled, not faintly, not briefly, but fully. And it changed everything, because it was not just a response, it was a release, a letting go of something she had been holding for too long. And Ethan felt it, not as a reaction, but as something deeper, something that settled into place without needing to be defined. And he reached for her hand, not quickly, not forcefully, just enough to bridge the space between them. And Clara did not pull away, did not hesitate, her fingers resting against his with a quiet certainty that spoke louder than anything they had said. And for a moment, the world around them faded, not completely, but enough for them to recognize what had formed between them, something that had not been planned, not been pursued in the way either of them was used to, but had grown in the spaces they allowed, in the silence they respected, in the moments they did not try to control. And Ethan looked at her, not as a problem to solve, not as a mystery to uncover, but as someone he had come to understand in a way that did not require answers. And Clara met his gaze, not as a stranger, not as a customer, but as someone she had chosen to trust. And the city moved on around them, unchanged, unaware, but for them, something had settled, something had become real, and neither of them felt the need to say it out loud, because it was already there, in the way they stayed, in the way they did not let go. in the quiet certainty that had replaced everything else. And as the morning light continued to stretch across the park, Clara leaned slightly closer, not out of uncertainty, but out of choice, and Ethan did the same. And in that simple, unspoken movement, the distance between who they had been and who they were becoming disappeared completely, leaving only what mattered. Two people who had found something neither of them had been looking for, and had chosen, without hesitation, to keep it. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to like, share us where are you watching from, and share the video, and subscribe to Love After Everything channel for more powerful and emotional stories like this. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful content that stays with you long after the video ends.